And then you go to our gospel today, and you've got Simon Peter, who Jesus said 3 different times, said, you're going to betray me 3 different times. And Simon Peter says, no, I won't. And then he stands there and he does it. Not once, not twice, but 3 different people. And this, 3 different times, and this is the person that God calls, Jesus calls, to start the church. What is the deal? All they can do are find used people that kill people and that deny people, and just makes you kind of wonder. It makes you wonder who God calls and why God calls them. And so with that, I thought I would share my call story. When I first I was a mom and raised the 4 kids. And then I decided that I was being called by God, but the way that I found out about being a deaconess was really weird. How many of you have ever heard of a deaconess before I got here? So most of you had. I'm impressed. I didn't have a clue it existed. How many of you have heard of Stephen Ministry? All right. So I had been selected to go to become Stephen Minister trainer, and so I went from North Carolina up to Maryland. And there were almost 500 of us. There were 487 people there. And the very first night, we were all walking from where we were staying in the dorms at Loyola over to the cafeteria. And I started talking to this person and talking to this person. And as I'm talking to her, I noticed the back of her shirt, and it says, "We Do Feet." And I said, "That's an interesting shirt. Why does it say We Do Feet?" And then the front of it had little footprints on it. And she said, "Well, I'm a deaconess." And I said, "What's a deaconess?" Now, Stephen Ministry isn't just for Lutherans, and so there weren't just Lutherans there. So the fact that I'm walking next to a Lutheran and that she turns out to be a deaconess is kind of crazy. And she said, "Well, we're the deaconess community, and what we do is that we wash feet because that's what Jesus did, and because we serve the lowest and we serve the highest. And so we have a knee-bending ministry and we have a toe-tipping ministry." And so I said, "Okay." And so she's starting to tell me everything they do. And she goes, "What we do is when people need food, we take it to them. And what we do is when hurricanes come, we help them do that." And everything she's telling me is making my heart excited, because this is what I knew I wanted to do. And I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And she said, "Well, there's this place called Valparaiso in the Lutheran Deaconess Association there." And she said, "And they've got this new program that just started. And if you're over 35, she said, are you 35? And I was 37. Yes, I'm over 35. And she said, "Well, we take 4 people a year, and you can go through this program, and you can become a deaconess." And I said, "You mean I don't have to leave my 4 kids at home?" And she said, "No, we kind of like moms to stay with their kids." So I said, "Okay, this is really cool." So I do that, and I'm thinking, I don't know how we're going to afford this and all of this kind of stuff. And it just fell in place. The church that I was serving had a guy that traveled all the time, and I to this day do not know who this gentleman was, but he gave me all of the frequent flyer points I needed to go to Valparaiso the 4 times that I needed to go. They took up they paid for all of my tuition, the church that I was serving did. I mean, it was amazing the way it worked. And somebody in the congregation, there were some summer classes that I need to take. No, that was another one. Anyway, so I became a deaconess and then went into this church to serve. And so in this church that I was serving after I became a deaconess and became consecrated, I had been there a couple of years, and I was working on my master's in Christian education. And this is where that particular congregation had a pilot. And over the summers, I would take 3-week classes up in Columbus, Ohio, from Raleigh to Columbus, Ohio. And this pilot just liked to fly, and so he would pick me up, and we'd go get in his plane on Sunday afternoon, and he'd fly me up to Columbus and drop me off, and he'll say, "I'll be back on Friday to pick you up again." And he'd fly up and pick me up on Friday and fly me back home. And who has a pilot in their congregation that just happens to have a plane? Anyway, God was just amazing. And one weekend in particular, I was coming home because we had tickets to a James Taylor concert. And he goes, well, we certainly want to get you home for that. So I had been serving this congregation for a while. And in November, the head of Christian education thought that she had uterine cancer. And so around Thanksgiving, she had a hysterectomy, and it turned out that that wasn't the case. And so in December, it was diagnosed that she had asbestos cancer. You see all of those commercials and everything on television. She was 45 years old, and she had a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. And she died on Valentine's Day. Now, on the 5th of April, we had a person in our congregation who was 33, and he died of AIDS. And so that was January. February, she died. The end of February, we had a 30-year-old grad student that had gone into where the post office boxes are, but it was in like an outlying post office thing. And he had left his car, went in there to get his mail, turned around, and someone had come off the railroad tracks with a gun and shot him right there and killed him and took his car and drove off. No reason, wrong place, wrong time. So that was 3 by the end of by the end of February. Then in March, we had someone in the congregation that was in their early 80s, and it was like, okay, now there's a sense of normalcy. I mean, you would, not that you ever want anybody to die, but someone in their 80s is more what you're thinking about than someone in their 30s or their 40s. And so he died, and the congregation came out to support the family as they had with the other ones. And then in April, there was a family who had 4 girls, and the girls ranged from 15 up to 24, and the 24-year-old was getting married. And so all 4 girls had been children of the congregation, so it was a big deal for the whole congregation. And on Friday night, they had the wedding, and everybody was excited, and they all came home, and the 15-year-old said, I want to go back out, and the mom said, no, you really need to stay here. Well, the 15-year-old had been able to have some champagne, and so she was still under the influence of the champagne, and so she called her boyfriend, and she goes, come get me. So it was just before midnight, and he came and got her, and she snuck out of the house, and she got in the car, and they pulled out of the street they lived on and onto the main drag, and it had an esplanade down the middle of it, and as soon as they turned, he said, I thought you weren't supposed to be here. And she goes, yeah, my mom told me not to go. And he says, well, I'm not going to get in trouble with your parents. And so he turns around as soon as he can to take her back home, less than a block away. She opens the car door, she jumps out, and her head hits the curb. So Friday night, they marry one, and on Tuesday, they're told that they've got 48 hours before they have to take the plug off of the other one because she can't survive but bring everybody in that they want to. So we had buried a 45-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 33-year-old, an 83-year-old, and now a 15-year-old. Then we had another gentleman in the congregation that was in his 90s die. And again, that kind of, nothing ever really settles it, but that kind of made a little bit of sense. And then we had Rhonda. And Rhonda was 35. And Rhonda and I had become friends way back. And she had a kindergartner and a third grader. And Rhonda had had breast cancer after the first child, after Preston, who was in 3rd grade. And they had done everything that they could, and she supposedly was breast cancer free. And then they said, if you want to have another child, do it quickly. And so she had this precious little girl called Avery. And so Avery was born, and then the breast cancer came back. And she fought it every which way she could, and by about January, it was pretty obvious that she probably wasn't going to win. And so from January until May, I met on a weekly basis with that family, and we prepared the 2 kids for the ultimate that their mom was going to die. And her husband's name was Dan, and we talked to them. And so the Friday before Mother's Day, the two kids came home, and God just told me, you need to stop by there. And so I went, and I had taken a hymnal with me so we could pick out music and that kind of thing for the funeral. And I get there right as the kids come in, and they had the beautiful Mother's Day drawings, that kindergartners and third graders do with, hands that are a little bitty thing and 5 fingers coming out of them, and just precious. And we put those on the refrigerator because their mama was asleep, and they went out to play. And about 45 minutes later, the hospice nurse came down, and she said, Rhonda's gone. And so Dan went up to be with her, and then he came back downstairs, and he goes, will you go with me to get the children? And so we went to get the children, and Rhonda had really liked being outdoors and being in the garden. And so when she could no longer garden, her neighbors knew this was important, and they had done all of the gardening for her. And so she had this precious little place that they had put up a little tent cover for her to go under. So Dan and I and the two kids went, and we went into that little area, and we sat down on the grass, and Dan had Preston on one side and Avery on the other side. And he said, I want to tell you something. And I sat down next beside him, and he said, you know that Mommy loves you? And they said, yes. And he said, and you know that Daddy loves you? And they said, yes. And he said, well, the angels have come and taken Mommy away. And at that point in time, this white butterfly came up, and it flew right by me, and right by Avery, and right by Don, and right by Preston, and it just flew away. And it was the most absolutely beautiful thing in the world. Now, one of the last conversations that I had with Rhonda was, she said, Deaconess Shawn, I want you to do my funeral. And I said, I can't do your funeral, I'm not ordained. And she goes, I want you to do my funeral. And I said, well, I can do prayers, but I can't do the funeral itself because I'm not ordained. And she goes, well, I want you to get ordained. And I said, well, I can't get ordained in time to do your funeral. And she goes, that's okay, I want you to get ordained. She goes, you need to go get ordained. And I didn't say anything more about it, and then not too much later, she goes, you're going to go get ordained, aren't you? You're going to go get ordained. And so she died that Friday, and I was already going to take classes in June. And at the funeral, Dan came up to me, and he said, she wanted me to tell you that she really thinks that you need to go get ordained. And so I took the classes that I was going to take towards my Christian ed and just directed it over to being ordained. But what that 5 months of all of those deaths, all of those, a lot of the cases, just senseless deaths told me, that there is a God that loves us totally and completely. And in these times in our lives when we cannot understand anything, that God is there. And when I look at today's gospel, and these people have just lost, the disciples have just lost Jesus, their best friend ever, and they don't have any idea what to do now. Their leader's gone. And they say, let's go fishing. And Jesus comes to them where they are. And Jesus came to me where I was through Gwen Bazajou in Maryland. I'd never been to Maryland before. I didn't expect to have my whole life changed when I went there in the way it did. But I felt truly called to be a deaconess. And then Rhonda, in her short 35 years of life, changed my life completely because it took me on another direction and to become ordained. So I don't know what God has in store for you, but God meets you where you are every single day of your life. And God comes to you in different ways. And in either of these cases, would I have expected someone I'd never met before to tell me about being a deaconess, or someone that was dying and 35 and saying, this is what you need to do? So don't discount anybody. God has called you to be here, and God has called you to who you are. And God continues to work and call each and every one of us in each and every way. And if you ever don't know what to do, they tell you today in the gospel, just go fishing. And all God's people say, amen.